The Bostock decision, released last week from the Supreme Court, is going to have significant implications. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. It takes a phrase like seismic shift to really describe just how much the 2015 Supreme Court decision in Obergefell versus Hodges really altered the political and cultural landscape. Not only was marriage redefined across all cultural sectors and for an entire nation, but it had a huge impact on religious freedom. In an instant, those who held traditional beliefs about marriage became social pariahs. Now, if the Obergefell earthquake was the legal and cultural equivalent of magnitude 7, last week's Bostock v. Clayton County decision, that might be a magnitude 9. Now, if you're like me and you had to look up how earthquakes are actually measured, that's about 20 times as powerful. Before Bostock, only a minority of states prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. In most states, bakers, florists, other business owners were largely safe from lawsuits and penalties currently faced by people like Jack Phillips and Baronelle Stutzman. Last week's decision probably changed all of that. Not only did Bostock effectively rewrite the Civil Rights Act in the area of employment, it's difficult now to imagine a federal court also not applying its logic to areas such as housing and education. And while the Bostock case specifically dealt with Title VII, the next domino to fall will likely be Title IX, which prohibits sexual discrimination in education. As Ryan Anderson of the Heritage Foundation pointed out, Bostock would either require the elimination of all sex-specific programs and facilities, or allow access based on an individual's subjective identity rather than their objective biology. And to do otherwise at this point would be to violate Justice Gorsuch's absurd conclusion that any differential treatment on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity requires discrimination based on sex. Now, of course, a test case would have to be litigated first, and that means there is still time for Congress, who should have done this in the first place, to, quoting Anderson again, clarify that when it uses the word sex in civil rights statutes, it does not refer to sexual orientation and gender identity. And Congress still has time to clarify that educational institutions that offer single-sex facilities and sports programs on the basis of biology aren't discriminating. It's common sense. And it's especially good for women. Now, of course, Congress had ample time to act before the Bostock case, but they failed to do so. Whether that's a failure of conviction or a failure of moral courage is not clear. Either way, here we are. Of course, in his Bostock opinion, Gorsuch did claim to be, quote, deeply concerned with preserving the promise of the free exercise of religion that's enshrined in our Constitution. Unfortunately, that's a nice but meaningless sentiment now, given the erosion of religious freedom since Obergefell and the way he rewrote the Civil Rights Act last week. Some, such as David French, point to potential safeguards for religious freedom, such as the First Amendment, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and even provisions in Title VII itself, which provide limited religious liberty protections. There's also a series of cases on the court's docket that could, as French suggests, dramatically increase the number of employees at colleges, schools, and religious institutions that are left outside the scope of Title VII. And there's still the possibility the court might try to balance Bostock by overturning state and local laws that require religious nonprofits like foster care and adoption agencies to violate their religious beliefs. Well, unfortunately, even if every single one of these things happens, which is far from certain, only religious institutions at the end of the day would likely be protected. And that means that great harm would still be done to the concept of religious freedom in at least 3 ways. First, business owners and employers with religious conviction, people like Jack Phillips, would be robbed of much of their First Amendment rights. The religious freedom they, too, should enjoy would be neutered down to some kind of privatized freedom of worship. Second, the government would be the ones deciding which organizations and institutions count as religious and which do not. And if we learned anything from the HHS mandate debacle, when institutions that served the public or were too large were not considered to be religious institutions, well, we don't want that. Finally, by siding with the gay and transgender plaintiffs in this case, the court majority has already put millennia-old objections to same-sex relationships and gender subjectivity into the same category as anti-Semitism and racism, as a kind of bigotry that should be ostracized from cultural influence. So yes, if you feel that the ground beneath our feet has shifted, you're right. Now fortunately, there's a psalm for that. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. Selah indeed. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.